So I will now introduce Dr. George Greer. So Dr. George Greer is a psychiatrist and a founding member of the Hefter Research Institute. And he was actually one of the first people, the first therapists or psychiatrists to actually do MDMA-assisted psychotherapy back in the early 1980s, before it was made illegal. And not only was he doing this work thoughtfully and carefully, but he was very systematically documenting, essentially generating a lot of the wisdom that guided the trials to come. And so then George actually brought that, his professional observations to bear at the DEA hearings on the scheduling of MDMA in 1985, which they won, but unfortunately the DEA overturned the judge's decision and it was made illegal. Mm-hmm. And this is actually, just for context, this is occurring about a decade and a half into the dark ages, the so-called dark ages of psychedelic science and research. And around this time, then, George is also part of this seminal group that met at Esalen. So, Rick Doblin and Dave Nichols and Terrence and Dennis McKenna, Rick Strassman, who met, and this was the birthplace, in a sense, of the new Renaissance, which we're now living through today. And then, so from this comes MAPS with Rick Doblin and Hefter, of course, from George Greer and Dave Nichols and their team. And throughout this time, since then, Hefter has been involved in helping to fund some of the first research. So, the first randomized double-blind controlled trial for psilocybin in late-stage cancer, anxiety, people with anxiety and late-stage cancer, with Charlie Grob at UCLA. And so here we are now, 40 years after some of this work started, and we're seeing what George Greer helped to start and grow really come to fruition. We have multi-million-dollar research institutes at some of our best institutions, and predominantly positive media attention, and actually facing the real possibility, the likely possibility of reinstating MDMA and psilocybin as legitimate medicines in the next few years, optimistically. So, I have a ton of respect for you, George. I see you as a bridge from old to new and clinic to research, and in a really unique position to share with us what we're calling the long view of psychedelic research. And it doesn't hurt that, George is also an extremely kind person. So thank you, George, for being with us. And I'll hand it over to you, and you'll speak for maybe about an hour or so, and then please post your questions, and we can then all chat at the end.
Okay, well, Gianni, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm a little flushing a little bit because you were so kind. Yeah, so this, I've done different talks and stuff, but this really is, this is the second one I've done for a psychedelic interest group. The first was for University of New Mexico, where I am. So from those groups, I decided to start giving MDMA, and found through this legal research that I could manufacture a drug and give it to a patient of mine, and that all physicians in California and all pharmacists in California could legally do the same. This was an opinion by the California Attorney General sometime, I don't know, early 80s or it must have been late 70s. So on that basis, I did the same thing with MDMA as ketamine, except I made it in Sasha Shulgin's laboratory one day. So we made 80 grams, and so I had a supply, and I started administering it to people on a professional basis with my wife, who was a psychiatric nurse, Rika Talbert at that time, now Rika Greer. And we did this for 5 years, about 100 people, about 80 people, about 100 sessions, most in their home. It was either their home or our apartment. home atmosphere. And like Gianni said, I had no, San Mateo, no formal research training at all. We just thought of every possible question we could ask before and after their session, and then we wrote it up. And the main thing that, this was before anybody knew anything about Mdma except maybe a couple of sentences in the paper by Sasha and Dave Nichols. So we found that when couples did it, they really learned to talk more directly, intimately, say what's on their mind, not holding their punches, both positive and negative things with their spouse or partner. And they found that they could continue to communicate in this direct, intimate way afterwards, really indefinitely. The 2 years, I think, was the longest follow-up we had then. But so people actually learned something that had a carryover, but that was really about it. No one had any PTSD, any serious psychiatric anything that was ever disabling, just too risky. So in 1985, DEA emergency scheduled MDMA. There were hearings, as Gianni said, and I testified at those, as I was really the only totally above ground practitioner in terms of my MDMA supply that was totally legal and kosher. And that was intense, as you might imagine. So that briefly is my personal story before Hefter. Now Hefter, Dave Nichols founded Hefter, and he said, 93, he said he was doing it because if he didn't do it now, it probably wouldn't happen. He would kick himself because in the early 90s, FDA had opened up to psychedelic research for the first time since the early 70s with Rick Rossman's DMT study of healthy normals. And Rick was here at UNM, and we were friends and everything at that time. So Dave started Hefter, asked me to join, and I took on the role of secretary. They were starting some incorporation things here in New Mexico. So I basically have run the Institute the whole time. We started out, one of our first studies was, we actually co-funded with NIDA, with John Halpern at Harvard. It was a neuropsychological study of Native American church members on the Navajo reservation. And they compared that group with religious, non-mescaline taking Navajos and non-religious Navajos. And no difference neuropsychologically at all with that. Another early project was in Russia, in St. Petersburg, ketamine for 2 ketamine sessions for heroin addiction. And that also showed great promise. We funded a lot of MDMA mechanistic research in University of Zurich Hospital with Franz Vollenweider into the 90s. And then around 2000, Charlie Grobe, who had done the first MDMA study for FDA in healthy normals, wanted to do that for terminally ill patients, cancer patients, struggling with anxiety. And he realized that, these are frail people, and he decided psilocybin would be safer. So he made that study psilocybin, and I helped him on that. And it took ridiculous amount of time because of recruitment was incredibly slow and difficult. The cancer patients were not interested in taking a drug that would make them lose ego control. I mean, not surprising because that's what death is, you lose ego control. But it came out well, and those people were ill. A lot of them did worse at the end because they were physically dying, so their quality of life went down. But it came out well, and at 6 months, there was a small signal for antidepressant action. And then Steve Ross at NYU and Roland Griffiths at Hopkins did something similar with a higher dose. Harvard UCLA was 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. This is 0.3, so over 20 milligrams of psilocybin. And those papers, a lot of you are probably familiar with. We funded most all the psilocybin research in this country, and in all but in Zurich, and we're very proud of that. And we see ourselves with USONA. Hefter is research, USONA is development, drug development. So those two cancer studies, well, three, I guess, including the first one, have allowed USONA to move into drug development, and FDA has accepted that. They're going into phase 3. They're doing their own phase 2 and 3. So we sort of handed off the baton to USONA, and they're doing that now. We funded a lot of other psilocybin projects. Our main projects now are all on addiction. 2 pilot studies on smoking and alcohol at Hopkins and UNM. And then now double-blind placebo at Hopkins and UNM, Hopkins smoking, UNM alcohol, 80 at Hopkins, 100 at NYU, including placebo group. So those will come out in the next year. And also helping with the cocaine psilocybin project at University of Alabama, Birmingham. And now actually 4 opioid use disorder related projects. One is just now starting, still having difficulty recruiting in the pandemic in Wisconsin, for people stable on buprenorphine, because we don't want them to relapse and die from an overdose if they recover and then have a relapse. So that's what the buprenorphine is for. And the other is that in Vancouver is going to do a study on polysubstance, and then Johns Hopkins LSD for chronic back pain patients who overuse their opioids. And this will be the first LSD treatment study in humans approved by FDA probably since 1970, I'm thinking, so 50 years. So all that is very exciting. And the newest thing we're doing is this will start in probably April. This is called the Young Investigator Program. And hopefully some of you will apply. This is the first time Hefter has had a pool of money available for research before we had the proposal. Before it's been the researchers propose research, we decide, and our philanthropists decide if they want to fund it. But this time, one of our philanthropist board members has pledged $500,000 a year for 5 years, primarily for young researchers, but not excluded to that. And we have some ideas, different amounts, but certainly for people getting their PhD, need to do their PhD project, postdocs who want to get a career started in psychedelic research. And it probably is most ideal for people who have some sort of salary grant, so their salary's covered, but need, 50 to 100,000 for research expenses, or maybe less. And we also understand that really it takes about 3 years to do a PhD dissertation proposal, so we're aware of that. So that'll be coming along, and if you go to the Hefter website under contact, you'll see a description. If you have research you want to do, it'll tell you to go to research.hefter@protonmail.com. And those will come to me. So that's exciting because with this FDA stopping the research, a whole generation of research and young researchers was lost, a whole generation, and we've had to start just by bootstrapping. And so now we are all like 70s. I'm 70, some are older. We need the young researchers to keep this going. So that's why we're starting that. Okay, so now we're almost half through. I want to get into the so-called long view of things, and this will be more, I hope it's not too stream of consciousness, but just to cover some ideas I've had that aren't in books or things. So recent history of the field is the first thing. In the last few years, and you are here probably because of this whole group exists because of this, the media primarily have exploded with stories about psychedelic research. That's partly from the videos of our subjects who've gone up on our Hefter website, hefter.org. There's a media page, video page. And in fact, one of the people I interviewed was a woman, alcoholic woman, and she's on there. She said watching the videos of the cancer patients really made her feel more comfortable taking psilocybin herself, even though it was for alcohol dependence. So we found that recruiting for treatment studies is definitely the rate limiting step, extremely difficult. I don't know, many of you have done lots of research, but it can be 10 or more screened people to one person who's accepted into the study. And it took years for the NYU people, Hopkins people to recruit. It took years to do those studies. I think 9 years from initiation to publication. But now it's going faster. Ben Kelmindy at Yale is doing an OCD study, and he's got people lined up from the OCD clinic there. So that is definitely better. And Michael Pollan's book obviously was sort of a watershed event. And, my mother-in-law, 88 years old, asking us about Michael Pollan's book, my 95-year-old local psychiatry patient asking about it. So that got everywhere, and that's been tremendous. The other thing that has begun, which has really created a lot of emotional stress, worry, fretting, probably most of it not necessary, but still, we're human, is all the emergence of for-profit startup companies who want to be involved in psychedelic research and or treatment. The first was Compass, of course, which is huge, and I think one of their studies is at Stanford, but there's a lot of, I'm not really talking so much about them, but all these venture capital startups. In my experience of them, and maybe some of you are part of those companies, but my experience is that the people who have started them, almost all, I'd say all of them I've talked to have had a transformative personal experience with the psychedelic that helped them tremendously. And some of them, they're family members, some maybe family members with addiction, et cetera, or post-traumatic stress. So their heart's definitely in the right place. And really, they're doing the same thing that I did. I'm a psychiatrist. These are my skills. This is what I'm interested in. So I bring those skills to this problem. So they're bringing their financial skills to it. But some of my discomfort is that it gets into the set and setting, actually, where I think about it. The mindset of, in a business, the purpose of business is to earn profit, right? that is a purpose. The purpose of psychedelic therapy is something different. It's more personal. And, then there's the whole medical industry, which is to heal people, and much of it is for profit, and obviously a lot of that works. Some of it doesn't work very well. But my feeling is that the drug itself is treated more of as a commodity and a means to an end, or the experience is a means to the end for the business. But think about this. Say you're a recreational LSD user in the 1960s, and someone says, here's LSD, this is Owsley LSD, made by Owsley, who was probably the most famous LSD chemist. And here's LSD, and from this other dealer, and you don't know who made it. Which LSD, assuming they're identical, which LSD do you think would give you a better mindset about your experience? Well, it's going to be the one from the famous person. So likewise, so somewhat likewise, if you've been given psilocybin that you paid just at cost, USONA is making their psilocybin at cost to patients because people gave, 60, $70 million philanthropically to get it approved through FDA. Versus some of the money that you pay for the drug is going to, investors in public companies, public investments, and you don't know who they are, where their money goes, what they spend it on, anything. So would you rather have psilocybin that's a gift or psilocybin that you bought and paid for all the drug development? So people might have different answers, but I would, having it as a gift, it makes me feel loved. And if you think about, people receive gifts from someone who generally loves them or cares about them. And if you think about, say, depression, PTSD, facing death, people generally feel unloved. It's not in the DSM, but that's a common thing of most, non-primarily biological psychiatric disorders. So I think that's important. And but I think the main place that the new for-profit startups are needed is in clinics, psychedelic clinics, because there's a group here in Santa Fe setting up a psychedelic clinic. They're part of Mdma expanded access program, one of the first 5 or 10 locations. They're mostly younger therapists. They don't have a lot of savings. They need money to set up a clinic, to start startup costs. So definitely, I think for-profit business is essentially necessary to either run or earn money and give money to nonprofit businesses. So our group is nonprofit because they're raising money. But the numbers of people who need psilocybin and MDMA therapy for depression and PTSD are, millions of people. And they're going to need hundreds of thousands of therapists, which cannot be, you can't do that just by, give us some money, then we'll train some therapists. It really has to be done with investors. So I see that as the main thing that is needed for psychedelic therapy to progress, is for-profit clinics to start forming. And I would guess about 2 to 3 years, they'll be FDA approved. Now, so let's talk about FDA. People my age, grew up with FDA as the enemy. They shut it all down. In fact, Jen Fadiman there in Palo Alto, I think, Stanford Research Institute, was in the middle of running a LSD group session on creativity when he opened a letter from FDA, said, you must stop your research immediately. He said, well, I think we got this letter tomorrow, because he didn't want to go in and tell people they had to stop, but it was just shut down abruptly. And it was the war on drugs, et cetera. So when I was finishing up my work with MDMA in the mid-1980s, just before it got scheduled by DEA, there was one man who was older. He had multiple myeloma, by far the most dramatic success of any patient I treated, because he had severe chronic pain from his myeloma. He couldn't function. He couldn't do recreational things. His guided imagery to reduce the pain had stopped working, and he was miserable. Very smart guy, miserable, very spiritual person. When he took MDMA, he was pain-free for the first time in years, 3 or 4 years, singing. And After several weeks, the pain started to come back, and he took Mdma again, and then it went away again. And so every 6 weeks he took it, about maybe, I don't know, 4 times, and then he passed away from the cancer. Though before that, he'd been one of the longest lived people with multiple myeloma, I think 10 years. So before he passed away, but after it was scheduled, I wrote in FDA and said, I want a compassionate permit to give this person Mdma with the supply I have, because it helped him so much. It's compassionate, and he's got terminally ill, he's got cancer, so can I do that? And they said, no, you need more animal research. Interestingly, I don't remember they pointed out the lack of, chemistry documentation, because basically it was, I made it in Sasha's lab, here's a little printout of the NMR spectrum, and that was it, nothing like GMP. So they said, no, you cannot give this person MDMA, you need more animal research first, and then he died. So very negative impression of the FDA. However, in the early 1990s, FDA reorganized, and a new person was in charge of the Psychiatry Products Division, Curtis Wright, who graduated from Haverford College the same year I graduated from Vassar College, 1972. I actually went to Haverford during that time, and I would guess most people at Haverford took LSD. I mean, I don't know that Curtis Wright did, but he was certainly around people who did. And he obviously wasn't afraid of psychedelics. And he called me up and he said, do you still want to give MDMA to that patient of yours? I have your request here. I said, well, thank you, but he passed, he died. And he said, so we talked. He said, well, we're open again. We want to research psychedelic drugs on the same basis as any other drug. And we're open for that. So that was huge. It led to Rick Strassman's submitting his DMT proposal to FDA, which was approved. It led to Dave Nichols saying, I need to start Hefter now because the FDA is allowing research and we just need money to pay for it. So that was a really big deal, and that's really responsible for this renaissance, is FDA opening up. These days, I can't imagine FDA being more supportive to psychedelic research and drug development than they are. When the USONA team, including Roland Griffiths and Steve Ross, went to meet with them, their idea was, because their concept was, this is, I'll just say, emotional distress from cancer, which includes anxiety and depression. So they called this, I don't know what they call it, existential depression or whatever. But it really, over the DSM-5, it encompasses major depression, depressive, adjustment disorder with depression. Then there's acute stress disorder with anxiety, adjustment disorder with anxiety, generalized anxiety, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, they said, it's not going to work to do multiple diagnoses, but why not? But FDA suggested, why don't you make the indication major depression? In other words, everybody with depression could then get psilocybin. And we were kind of shocked because we thought they would want to start small and not have many people do this, but no, they wanted to get it out there to the greatest number of people who could benefit from it. So that was the first indication of how supportive FDA was. Then last year, I think it was last spring, FDA sent a contingent of their psychiatry drug products people to a psychiatry conference in Arizona. And they put on a whole presentation workshop or whatever called Psychedelic Drug Development. So FDA is going to Arizona to tell psychiatrists how to develop psychedelics into approved FDA drugs. So that's how supportive they are. They don't cut any corners at all. You have to dot all the I's, cross the T's, but they are very supportive. And I might add DEA also. I'm a apart from Hefter and all this psilocybin stuff, I'm back in, or well, hopefully after the pandemic, in the Mdma world because actually 2.5 years ago, Michael Midover asked me to start a third site to train the therapists for Mdma. So we got that all set up, took a long time, long story. But when the DEA people came to inspect it, like, you know, the burglar alarms, the locked closet and the file cabinet to store the drug storage issue, really. It was two, I'd say younger, in their 40s, people dressed casually, came in, very supportive of the research we were doing, super friendly, super helpful, no raised eyebrows or criticism at all, no suspicions, no pointed questions, etc. So that was just pretty wonderful, actually, to have such a positive response from DEA people after the sort of grilling in the 80s at the hearings about MDMA. So it's really, it's just a different world than it was back in the 80s. So Jenny asked, what have you seen change? Well, I've seen this change, the mindset in FDA, DEA, but in the public and in psychiatry and in science. I think the only negative comment we have seen from anyone about psychedelic research was from I think he was in UK maybe. He had his own blog and he was criticizing some of the Hopkins research for being biased, basically, being biased, that the results were biased, etc. And I think people responded saying, you know, the instruments, etc., just don't allow for bias, blah, blah, blah. But other than that, all the psychiatrists, all the scientists, all the people I've talked to think this is great. I even have, it's like a pen pal. He's 80 now. He went to my high school 10 years before me in Fort Worth, Texas. Classic conservative, you know, W. Bush, war in Iraq, fabulous. Trump, man, Trump is completely awesome, going to solve all our problems. He thinks MDMA and psilocybin should be approved, that they're great for humanity, great for people suffering. And that was very surprising to me because it's not what I expected from, you know, the 70s, the 80s, that whole mindset, you know, Nixon, blah, 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 Republicans. And then there's a conservative conservative political supporter gave $1 million to MAPS for MDMA research because it helps veterans. Another thing, let's see, it was sometime earlier in the year where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, there's a video of her on C-SPAN advocating for an amendment to, I think, a giant budget bill, you know, jillions of dollars, to put something in that grants can go for research of drugs that are Schedule I drugs, something to make it easier. And, you know, she's very passionate in her talk, but she got, or actually through MAPS, their political connections, through veterans actually, got Matt Gaetz, I think that's how you say it, Gaetz from Florida, who's like total Trump supporter, to co-sponsor her amendment. So to have, you know, conservative / more Republican parts of society be in not only not criticizing, but supporting psychedelic research. And I want to say research, this is not recreational use or use outside of a legal context. I mean, that's a huge change. And, you know, my fear had been, well, sooner or later, people are going to have their mystical experiences on psychedelics, going to talk about them. They're going to change their religion. They're going to all become Buddhists instead of Christians, and then the evangelical or more fundamentalist, I should say fundamentalist Christians in Congress are going to hold hearings and hold our feet to the fire for taking people's religion, Christian religion away. But when I interviewed that woman from Albuquerque on the video page, the Hispanic woman for alcohol, I didn't put it in the interview, but I'll tell you that she said she grew up in what she called a Christian cult, where her mother sewed her own clothes, very restricted life. And when she left home, she was probably in her 40s when I talked to her. She said, I explored a lot of things and found them useful. But on the first psilocybin experience is very painful. She just cried and cried, couldn't contact, feel, or connect with her children. The second was very positive, colors, lights. She said, all religions are coming from the same place, the one true God. And she is more involved, she said she's more involved with her evangelical Christian church in Albuquerque after her psilocybin experiences than she was before then. Plus she's sober. And a nice thing was she said her children said they were like elementary age. They said, she was playing with them in the yard football. And they said, Mom, after the psilocybin, they said, Mom, you never played with us before. She said, oh no, I played with you. Yeah, Mom, but you never ran before. You never ran after the ball. So she really had a change in her personality with her children and with her church. And so I don't feel worried about the whole religious challenge to psychedelics. And actually, I think if you looked at it non-ideologically, I think probably psychedelics, and certainly Mdma, would fit into most religions if the dogma allowed it, because it does, people lose that sense of individual me against the world and feel more connected to being, spirit, people, whatever, kind of like the experience I had when I was 19. So Gianni also said, where do you think you're going? Well, my personal goal for psychedelics is that everybody on the planet would have the opportunity to have an experience with the psychedelic, along with a guide from their own culture and own religion, if they are religious. I mean, will we ever get there? Probably not. I mean, most likely not. But that really is the goal to give, because I think that a psychedelic experience can give a person the opportunity to choose a different ideology, a different mindset, a different opinions about things from what they've been socialized to think. I remember when I was in college, after some of my experiences, when I would see commercials on television, I would feel angry because I thought the people making the commercial were trying to control me, because they were. And so I became, it was like a new awareness. I had no awareness of that before. So I think that is what psychedelics can do for quote normal people, people who aren't suffering from a psychiatric diagnosis. I think they can just be more open-minded. And in fact, there's a study out there by Catherine McLean from Hopkins on the personality construct of openness actually improved after people's psilocybin experiences there. And most of you know, personality factors don't really change in adulthood. So this was an important finding. So flexibility in thinking, new insights about, as opposed to rumination. There's the whole idea that the default mode network is sort of the rumination network in our minds, and that psilocybin can quiet that. And so all the negative rumination of depressed people or addicts, like, oh, I need to get high, where's some alcohol, where's some cocaine, that sort of repetitive drug-seeking mentation can stop. So when that stops, I think it allows for, it's not a good accurate word, but intuitive, let's say intuitive ideas, or new ideas, creative ideas, new ideas to come to the person as to what they want to do. And in fact, this goes back to the Russian research with ketamine. They had a grid showing you would put yourself on a grid. Where are you in terms of, I'm an addict, I'm a loser over here, or I'm a successful person over here, etc. And before and after the ketamine, people said, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a loser, their self-esteem is low, they're down in the corner here. And after the ketamine, all their dots are more on this side of the grid, and they're more, I have self-efficacy, I can control myself, I'm in control of my life, I'm an effective person, I'm not alcoholic, blah, blah, blah. So there's some, some evidence from an instrument about this. What outstanding questions remain? Too many to count. So, what outstanding questions? Okay. How much preparation and integration is needed before and after an Mdma or psychedelic session? We don't know. I think I don't know directly, but I think the Compass study may have a shorter integration and preparation, but I don't know. But if they do, if it does, and if that works, that's going to save the health system, jillions of dollars, because it's the therapy time that is so expensive for psychedelic research. The MAPS MDMA for PTSD protocol is 82 hours of a therapist, which is 41 hours of co-therapists. You figure even at $100 an hour, that's $8,200. And so it's probably going to be 10 grand for MDMA treatment. And how many people with treatment-resistant PTSD have $10,000? Health insurance certainly will pick it up at some point, and probably it'll be shorter. But how much of that is needed? Then this is a really interesting question, and Chuck Raison at Wisconsin and USONA is hopefully going to do this. Is a conscious, awake a mystical experience required for efficacy in depression or addiction? We don't know. I mean, how can you have a psilocybin experience that you didn't have subjectively? Because this for me really gets to what is so interesting about psychedelics is that they are not just biological. They are incredibly psychoactive. Most of the researchers think that it's both a neurobiological effect and a psycho-spiritual effect that leads to the benefit of psilocybin. And if you read those Hopkins and NYU cancer studies, both of them have correlations of the mystical experience questionnaire score with the depression, anxiety outcome variables. I think there was a back in some of those. So there is a statistical correlation between the degree of a mystical experience as determined by that questionnaire and the improvement on the depression rating scales and alcohol rating scales. So would that happen if the person was unconscious? So the idea is to give a drug that eliminates consciousness, awareness, and then give psilocybin, and hopefully a drug that doesn't interact with psilocybin. But of course, the problem is that, if you go downstream far enough, everything's affecting everything in the brain. At least that's my impression of it. And so I'm sure there will be some scientists who say, well, this could be explained by downstream effects, and it probably could. But still, it is a question. Is it a conscious experience, or is it biological? And finally, what is the heart of this work? I think the people doing it determine the heart of the work. For me, I guess I'm stuck on the last religion we studied in that religion course in college in Eastern religion was Buddhism. In Buddhism, it's an unusual religion in that there's no creator. There's no it's not monotheistic. In fact, it's probably atheist. There is no God. There is no anything. There's nothingness. Nirvana is just nothingness. So our pictures just disappeared. I'm not sure what's happening. Okay. Can you still hear me? Okay, great. You can still hear me. Great. Yeah, so the whole principle of Buddhism is that we don't exist as individuals. And my teacher there said, yeah, but there's all these people who don't know that we exist, which was kind of funny. But reduction in suffering is the goal of Buddhism. The life is suffering, and here's the answer to suffering is this eightfold path, and the suffering is about desire and illusion, blah, blah, blah. It's taking the world of sensory experience as real, etc. So I think about the suffering in the world, and the guiding principle for me, the heart of it is what use of psychedelics will reduce the most suffering in people. Medical care, that's what medicine is about, isn't it? Reducing suffering. And in psychiatry, one of the reasons that attracts me to psychiatry is that it's all about consciousness and meaning and experiential lived experience, our minds, our subjective thoughts, our feelings that aren't observable. They aren't measurable. You can't measure thoughts or feelings with a lab test at all. So I think that is, for me, that would be the heart of the psychedelic research is what is the goal of the person doing the research? What is the goal of the person doing the therapy? And the most important thing is what is the patient intention? And so I actually have a little bit more therapy pointers I've come up with over the years. So this has been a constant thought since I was doing Mdma in the 80s. The patient's intention is the most critical factor for the outcome of the session and for the preparation of the session. That the intention is the most important. That was our first question. That was our questionnaire. What is your important? What is your mindset? What is your intention? And then there's the therapist. What is the therapist's intention? And right now there are these treatments being taught. MAPS is teaching treatments, and I went through that training, and USONA is teaching treatments. And they'll have methods. And, I was educated in psychiatry before the cognitive behavioral therapy movement. So I was not trained in those methods. It was more analytic, existential, client-centered, et cetera. But I think what's important is that psychedelic therapy, the best therapists are determined by the person, not what they know. Leo's group, some of the best therapists really had no psychological training at all, zero. They had a lot of psychedelic mentoring and from Leo, but no formal training, no theory. They learned it on their own, and they were excellent. So if you've gone through a psychedelic training, and hopefully maybe some of you have, the whole focus is to be present, emotionally present with the client during their experience, because they will pick up on this through your nonverbal language, where your eyes looking, all those little signs of, oh, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that, and oh, and what am I supposed to do? And I had this experience in the MAPS training where I told people, they had me lecture there, I told them, don't do some method someone else told you, because then you're not present. If you're thinking, so what am I supposed to do next? What's the next step in the procedure? You're not with the person, they're going to pick up on that. And what did I do in our mock session but do exactly that, where I'm supposed to do this, and I caught myself and so it is insidious. It's insidious. And that you do what you feel is best in the moment, in the present moment, including the music. I mean, if you hate the music that you're listening to in the room, you're going to be distracted by that, and the patient's going to pick it up. So the music, your well-being, your consciousness, the whole therapy setup, everything has to be oriented so that you are in the optimum emotional, conscious, present state to be with the patient, because you have no idea where they're going to go, what they're going to come up with. Early lifehood trauma, they forgot. I mean, who knows? New ideas, new ontologies. You really have to be ready for anything. Silence for hours. Some psilocybin people are silent for hours. They're like they're in a coma, and the therapists are kind of freaked out and try to, not bother them. That can happen. So it's important that you use the method you believe is best, as opposed to another method that you might have faith in, because of distraction or present. Okay, so Gianni, I'll stop there and we can do questions.
Okay, great. Hey, first of all, thank you so much, George.
Yeah, it was wonderful to do.
For some reason, I got kicked off there for a few minutes, and I hope other people's screen got interrupted. I don't think they were, but anyway, I feel like I'm sitting there in your room with your holiday presents.
Well, I have the chat in front of me starting at 7:30. People saying hi.
Yeah.
You have that?
Yeah. I have those. I have some of those too. I have some of the questions written down. A few things.
Okay. Well, I'll just go through what I see here. The first one I see is the 821 Alex. That woman's response is what the theoretical model I'm developing would predict. Essentially,
So real quick, George.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, George?
Yes.
So there's the chat, and then in addition to that, there's the Q&A section.
Okay.
Which I do have, so I can feed you those. You don't have to worry about it.
Well, I'll just, since I started, I'll take this. This is the chat. This is not the questions, which I do not have. Got it. Sure. Okay. And Alex, I assume you're talking about the alcoholic woman. And basically what she said about her alcohol use, she actually responded to some little tear-off phone number in the supermarket or somewhere for the study or newspaper, and thought it was for her husband. So she went in herself because her husband wouldn't go, and they gave her some screening tests and said, well, you actually would qualify for this study. And she said, oh, well, I have an alcohol problem, like, duh. And like, well, yeah. And afterwards she said, I just slowly, insidiously slid into using alcohol every evening and kind of withdrawing from my children and my family. And I didn't really notice it, like it's not a problem. But she noticed it afterwards and noticed that she had lost that intrinsic meaning with her children and the things that are meaningful in her life. And she got that back. So that's exactly, the model you're developing is exactly that. And that is great because, depressed people don't have meaning either. life's a drag. It's not meaningful. I mean, lack of meaning is a symptom of depression, I would say. Okay, so now the official questions.
Yeah.
So there's
and
some.
I would just add to that. I think some of those, the joy or the benefit of hearing from you, like these images of this woman running for the first time with her kids, or this person with cancer singing because he's not in pain anymore. Those are the kinds of things that are not captured by, the MADRS score or
Yes.
or that symptom scale.
Yeah, so for that reason, let me say that most of the big studies now are doing qualitative studies of their participants. The alcohol study has done that. Now, let's see, the cancer study did that. One of them is called Dinner with Cancers. Cancer at the Dinner Table is a good one. And there's a couple from that NYU study. The alcohol study is going to start one at NYU. And so most of these big studies will have qualitative studies that get into the stories, the lived experience, because that is critical here as opposed to, an antibiotic study. I mean, there's no story there. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll hop into some of the questions. The first one that a few people, Alejandro asked, and a few people are curious, you had these experiences as part of a co-therapy dyad with your wife, and we have other examples of this dyadic therapy team in which there's they're spouses. So there's the Midhoffers and the Grafs and in some ways the Shulgins. But so he's curious because he's actually going to be a future psychiatrist, and his wife, he's mentioning it's a psychiatric nurse. I'm trying to think.
Oh, that's like me.
What are some of the what are the benefits? What were the benefits of that? What was that like, and what were the challenges of that as well?
Well, the first thing it reminds me of is, I don't know who told me this, but someone in the 80s, they had an LSD experience and out of town and flew to meet the person at the airport. And it might have been, it was probably an underground guide. And the guide met them with his wife, his spouse. And the person who was going to have the experience said, that was so reassuring to me to meet my guide's wife. Okay, I know him, this is his life, and I'm more assured about him, more trusting of him, less afraid, just to know that he has a real life and this is part of it. And so I think it's not something we measured, so I only have my subjective impression, but certainly my wife and I, we feel we have a good relationship, especially in those settings. And we modeled that kind of relationship and openness and presence because we were trying to be present. And so I'm sure that had effect on them. And with the couples, we're probably talking to them for hours during the session, So we're modeling that, and we're sort of discovering that together in a way, maybe. So I'm sure that modeled, but we also did sessions solo. I would do some sessions by myself, and Rika would do some sessions by herself. And, we only wrote up the first 29 people, which were all co-therapists. So I just don't have data on the couples that might have done it later. This was 35 years ago. My guess is that we may not have done any couples solo as a single therapist. We might have done all those with both of us since we were a couple. That would be my guess. There'd be no way to sort out that. Now, the reasons given now mostly for the dyads, male, female, or in Knapp's case, female, female, especially with PTSD, is, sexual assault victims who could be triggered by only a man. What's this man going to do to me? Or what's this woman going to do to me? But obviously it's more men, those worries about than women, I think. But that has happened, and that has happened. I know of 2 psychiatrists in the 80s who lost their licenses from being sexual with patients with psychedelics. And, I would consider them quasi-leaders in the field at that time. I met them at meetings, in Esalen and in Canada. And it's just horrible, to have someone you trust do that and lose their license, and that kind of narcissism and antisocial and all that stuff was just horrible. So, and in fact, MAPS has posted that one of their male researchers was sexual with a research subject, not after months later. And this was there were a couple doing this therapy together, a psychologist, psychiatrist. And I've known this person since the 80s at Esalen, and everyone who knows him was just shocked. I mean, how could this person, super smart, dedicated to psychedelics since the 70s, did his graduate school dissertation on MDMA therapy? How is this even possible? And I still don't understand that. But I think the more people are doing therapy, the more these outlier experiences are going to happen. It's just the nature of humanity. So, but now the reason given is the couples therapy. It's more the patient's feeling safe and to ensure no sexuality. All the sessions are videotaped now. We certainly didn't do that back then.
Yeah. Another question people are wondering about your take on, you've had experience now and with different indigenous cultures and underground therapists as well. So how do you see the incorporation of the wisdom from either the underground work and different indigenous uses of sacred medicines, their own sacred medicines, into what will become psychedelic therapy as approved by the FDA?
Yeah. Well, I'm 70. I'm retired from psychiatric practice after 40 years. I'm good, with that. But I consider myself someone who's trying to transmit or spread the things I learned from Leo Zeff to the people I talk to who are learning therapy. I mentor people in the CIS program, CPTR program, and psychiatrists. And because this is the spiritual side. Spiritual traditions have something called transmission. The Zen teacher transmits enlightenment to the Zen student or the monk. And I'm not as familiar with in Christianity the monks, but I think a lot of that is transmission, and it's really the human relationship, the human experience of another sentient being. Kind of wakes us up, having a therapist there as opposed to being by ourselves. It wakes us up. And that, I think, is important to get away from the concepts and into these other ways of thinking, and anthropological ways of thinking, really, traditions, history of religions, religious studies, other academic disciplines come into play with this, that we're not trained in normal psychiatry. We have to learn on our own. So I think we should do that, especially religion and spirituality, because that comes up a lot. And there was a woman at NYU, and she's going on camera a lot, and she said, I'm an atheist, but I met God on psilocybin, but I'm still an atheist. So all these paradoxicality is rampant, and you have to learn to be comfortable with that, and to be ready that everything you think is wrong, and just how does that feel? So
yeah, that reminds me of what you were talking about the maybe it's timely that psychedelics are getting more attention and legitimacy, because they may be one of the few tools to rediscover some common ground in what feels like a more and more tribalistic, divided world. That this is something that conservatives and liberals and people on different sides of the spectrum can both celebrate and support. and I would say, suffering doesn't discriminate based
No,
on
it doesn't. It's right.
political view. Everybody suffers. Everybody has a mother who suffers, or a friend who's dying, or someone with and so this ability of psychedelics, not only that we can get behind them, but that they have, if you can have an experience facilitated by them, that you might have more flexible views.
Yeah, and there are ways to get at that in research with neuroimaging and stuff that are being, people are starting to look at, ways of getting these detailed social cognitive processes with neuroimaging networks, and it's far beyond my knowledge, but people are, looking at these things.
Yeah, and I want to get to more questions. There's a ton of really good ones.
Okay.
One that just popped up, which is going to skip to the front of the line because I think it's a really good question. What are your thoughts on MDMA or psilocybin for physician burnout?
Yes, in fact, our researchers have proposed that. Psilocybin for burnout in healthcare providers and physicians, and especially now with the pandemic. I mean, it's in spades. And I have a friend, she's a hospitalist, in a hospital, and they're packed and there's masks everywhere, and she lives by herself, and it's hard. But that's definitely something. And I should say one thing, the funding world is odd with psychedelics these days because NIH has yet to give any grant that I've ever heard of for a psychedelic treatment research study directly. Some well-funded NIH researchers have given some of the money they have to things like someone at Hopkins is paying for imaging research on the smokers before and after, paid imaging on smokers, and found some interesting things. Michael Bogenschutz at NYU had a neuroimaging proposal for his alcohol study, no psilocybin involved, just before and after, to NIAAA, perfect scientific review score, perfect score. And the head of NIAAA said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to use a Schedule I drug to treat an addiction, because implying essentially because I say so. So there's some political things to be overcome because there's no federal funding. So all the funding for Hefter and MAPS comes from private individuals. And these are, some wealthy people, but they're not infinitely wealthy, they have limits. And so all these things we'd like to study like that, give us the money and I'm sure we could find people to study it, but it's expensive. It costs $10,000 to $20,000 per participant in our studies, depending on the study. So it's expensive.
That one stands out to me. I mean, certainly there are people who deserve and need it, perhaps more than healthcare workers. But the main point, you bring this up in your paper in 1985, where you're saying, MDMA. You notice that patients are having experiences after the fact, that MDMA is opening this window of direct communication and empathy, which endures beyond. And this is the kind of thing that seems like it could really, fight against the burnout. Being more inspired, feeling more connected to the work, to patients, etc.
Yeah, I think guilt is a lot of that, the psychodynamics of burnout, because with MDMA, it's virtually impossible to feel guilty or paranoid. I mean, I guess some people could, depending on them, but we called it, it blocks the fear response to a perceived emotional conflict. And that description still fits. There's a bunch of mechanism to that, but it's just hard to be afraid of things in that MDMA state for 3 hours or 3 or 4 hours.
So one question is addressing something that's coming up in the field a lot. There was just this pair of papers, one from Roland Griffiths that was suggesting that the subjective psychedelic mystical experiences are necessary or probably necessary for the full therapeutic benefit. And then this opposing paper by David Olson suggesting maybe these subjective experiences are not necessary, and there's this effort in some labs to tweak psychedelic molecules to subtract the psychedelic or mystical experiences, but that may still have antidepressant effects, anti-addiction effects. So someone I think in the audience is curious, what's your take on this attempt to separate out subjective or mystical experience from whatever other effects the drug might have?
Well, it's fine to do. It's a noble thing. It's a good thing to do. There's a whole DARPA program of tons of money to do that. I don't know how much it is, but it's a lot. And a lot of these startups are looking at that. And some have already, there's Ibogaine relatives that are not psychoactive that block withdrawal. I don't know there's been any of those that are not psychoactive that help depression or addiction, craving and repeated use. But I think it's a fine thing to do. That's more like normal drug development. Like, here's something in nature that has side effects. Let's tinker with the molecule to get rid of the side effects. So, I mean, I'm all in favor. Hopefully that can be done. And because I think most people with depression, they don't want to pay a lot of money and have this long drawn out thing. They just want to be able to feel better and enjoy their work and enjoy their families better. They don't want to spend all this time and money doing some other, newfangled thing. And they just want help that works. And antidepressants, a lot of people, need a lot of work. That's why they come to psychiatrists, because they don't want their family practitioner. So we definitely need that. But what the people I know are doing, it's just not our interest. It's just not our interest in that. And I would say, without naming names, most people most likely have had their own personal experiences, though some, interesting enough, have not, out of just, want to be rigorous and everything. But I think that's part of that.
Yeah, I know that nobody asked me for my opinion, but I say the same thing. To me, I think it's, if there's a treatment that helps, that's awesome. And if someone I knew was suffering, I'd give it to them.
Right.
I just don't think that it's just not psychedelic. It's just,
Right, yeah.
It's psychedelic only in its, molecular structural relation to something else.
It's related to, it's not a psychedelic. And there's something called Lyseride. It's a 2A agonist that's not psychedelic at all. It's used for like some sort of light illumination markers or something. And these I18MC and Ibogaine thing, and there's another Ibogaine thing now. Yeah, it's just different.
So I guess on this similar vein of benefit of an agent that may or may not have a full psychedelic or mystical experience, there is ketamine. And by the way, quick, just a time check. You have 4 minutes till 8 o'clock. So, I know it's late.
I'm not in a rush.
Okay, great. Yeah,
I would be streaming some TV show now if I wasn't talking to you guys, but I can do that later.
Okay, cool.
Another day, it's okay.
Great. Yeah, we'll hang on as long as.
I am going to turn on my fan. It's getting warm in here.
Okay.
I have a lot of lights on. Okay.
But so one of the questions is, what are your thoughts on the potential of so we have data for ketamine, one as used in the infusion model where the subjective effects are not emphasized, to say the least. What do you think its potential is as part of this, as creating a psychedelic experience, or for being considered as part of this, an agent that can create a psychedelic healing experience?
I'm sorry, I got distracted a bit. This woman named Singhal said she's leaving, and one of our people's last name is Singhal. If she has any relatives in Toronto, ask her to let me know.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, people are, I guess, just chiming in to say that they have to leave, and they're saying hello, and they very much appreciate you talking with us.
So I'm going to ask you to repeat your question because it was detailed. I want to get it exactly right.
It was just long-winded. It wasn't actually detailed. The question is basically, what are your thoughts about ketamine?
Well, I gave ketamine, as I mentioned, and again, no one with any severe problem. No one was certainly with major depression. We did give it to a woman, I would say, who I would call it dysthymic disorder, sort of low-grade chronic depression. She was a small woman, and we did all IM ketamine, averaging around 100 milligrams, and but based on body weight, uh, a milligram and a half per kilogram. So a 70 kilogram person get a little over 100. She was small, so she got less, and she did not fully sort of leave her body. She just cried and sort of sobbed and had a horrible time for that 30 minutes or so of the IM. And when she came back, she was just completely fine, as if nothing had happened. She remembered it, but she didn't seem traumatized. Her depression did not improve. And later she went on a Mdma, and her depression improved. So my conclusion from ketamine, and most other people I gave it to were sort of spiritual seekers, meditators, and the almost universal report from these people is that before ketamine, and these are meditators into that whole thing, okay? They had the intellectual belief that death is not the end of our conscious existence. And after ketamine, they said they were certain that's the case. That's true. So this whole depression thing is completely new to me, but now I'm in a ketamine group on Google about it. Gosh, there might be 100 practitioners on it, mostly physicians, a lot of psychiatrists and anesthesiologists, psychologists, a lot of people on it. And people are doing, and Phil Wolfson, especially in the Marine, is doing all sorts of psychotherapy with high dose IM, low dose IM, low dose IV, high dose IV, psychotherapy for PTSD, for, talk about trauma when people are on a mild, maybe a mild IV dose or IM. They can interact, but don't feel the panic, the fear so much, the defensiveness, which is like Mdma or like what's the short-acting barbiturate that was used a long time ago to get information from people that they couldn't remember or whatever, they'd forget it. I forgot, whatever, some people know. So I think it's like that, but this whole depression thing looks very biological to me, something I had no clue about. But ketamine, I think, can help people a lot more than just IV drip for depression and no therapy. And most of the people in this group, a lot of people who speak out are talking about having preparation, integration, time spent, not just going for the session and leave, really improves the outcome. These are psychiatrists who have been doing ketamine for over a decade, and hundreds and hundreds of patients in their cohort, and they're convinced that the people who had some interactive verbal therapy around it, about it, have better recovery from depression, etc., anxiety, than otherwise. So that's something I think important, and there's a lot more to be learned about it. A lot of people teaching things. Raquel Bennett puts on the Kriya conference.
She's here, I think, actually.
Oh, Raquel?
I think she's in the audience, yeah. Hey,
okay. Well, hi, Raquel, if you're there, great. A lot can be done with that. So, but ketamine, it's so short that it doesn't provide the hours. It's so short and it's dissociative. People, at least in my experience, don't have a lot of emotion, subjective emotion with ketamine. Now, I know some people do because I've heard about it, especially trauma, I would imagine. But it sort of detaches from the body, detaches from emotion. And it's only like an hour, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, as opposed to say 5 hours for psilocybin and MDMA. Time to feel things, feel trauma, work it through, do the sort of things that happen in a normal, intense psychotherapy session, but for hours. And I think that's why people say MDMA and psilocybin are like, months or years of therapy. They accomplish so much. And ketamine is so short, and at a high dose, it takes people out of the ability to talk or communicate in any meaningful way. Certainly the 100 milligrams IM does. So I think that they both have their place for someone who wants to go in and just do it and be fixed. Ketamine is more like that. But it's a good introduction. MDMA is sort of an introduction to psychedelics in a way. Ketamine like an introduction to psychedelics. So I think it's useful in that way. I'm sure there's more to talk about, but that's the main points I would make.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, thank you. And I think the dream is to have all of these as tools in the toolkit that it's not, which is better, it's which is appropriate for this person in this situation with this particular kind of suffering.
Exactly, thank you. And that's, to me, that's an important point I want to make here, is that research studies are all about groups of people. Clinical practice is all about unique individuals. They're like completely different from each other, but that's all we got, and there's this whole thing in research, you get this pure cohort of pure one diagnosis people, but that's not the real world. Who has one diagnosis? I mean, I haven't arrested very long because we just met last summer, but I worked at a center for trauma for about 10 years. Everybody, I mean, 5 is a usual number of diagnoses, plus axis 2. So that's just something that we the psychiatrists, we the clinicians have to translate research and apply it to the person sitting in front of us. And that's why I get paid the big bucks or whatever. It's not easy to do that.
Yeah, and I'll just toss in another 2 cents, which is that there's research proposals and ideas that there's the suggestion that psychedelic therapy works on these transdiagnostic processes like negative affect or this loss of meaning or these things which cut across anxiety and depression and addiction, etc.
Right.
So
Right.
it may be just a different way of thinking rather than this diagnosis, this treatment, maybe this type of suffering and this process that may help.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, addicts and depressed people have dysfunctional ruminations. They're different, but they both feel bad.
So getting to more questions here, Joshua is bringing this up. This I think a 2-part question. One is how in the years until MDMA and psilocybin are made legal, what are the possible avenues? I think we're aware of the expanded access and the compassionate use, but any practical ideas about how trainees or psychiatrists or other mental health providers can actually get started using those FDA-approved routes to provide these therapies under those provisions?
The only thing I think of is using ketamine, and a lot of the clinics that are going to provide MDMA are providing ketamine. The group here in Santa Fe is one of those. One is a nurse practitioner who already uses ketamine for pain, chronic pain. One's a psychologist, and there's a physician involved who's a former ER doc who has his own ketamine practice. So because it's completely illegal to use pure psilocybin or MDMA outside of a research study, so not happening. I have not heard of USONA planning any expanded access for psilocybin. It's very expensive, very time consuming. Having been sort of in the bottom rung of that, it's just very difficult and expensive and cumbersome. So ketamine is the only available drug now. In 2 years in Oregon, psychedelic mushrooms will be available. In Canada now, Health Canada, it's like the FDA in Canada, has made available access to psilocybin mushrooms for terminally ill patients. And they've asked researchers in Vancouver to provide data on just pure psilocybin for addiction treatment so they can make psilocybin mushrooms available for addicts before it's gone through the whole prescription approval process. So there's just no way to do that in the United States. So I would recommend, I think a lot of people doing this recommend ketamine because it's, I'd say 2/3 similar to psychedelics compared to regular psychiatry. It's just not the whole thing, but it's very similar: preparation, integration, altered state, loss of ego control. That's what I would suggest to people.
Yeah, and you touched on this. I think there has to be there's a balance between. I find that the right to try argument's really compelling. For people who are dying, for instance,
Yeah,
that just
right.
got approved in Canada to get psilocybin. Balancing that with trying to very carefully chaperone this through the process so that it becomes available to the most people. It's tricky, but I do find that the right to try really persuasive for those people. Anyway, more questions. What are your thoughts on the you mentioned this issue of access. So there are millions of people with depression, to say nothing of anxiety and addiction, and who are dying. And we have this bottleneck maybe of clinics and therapists who have yet to be trained, clinics which have yet to be opened. What are your thoughts on how we do this training thing? And the question I think was, where will this training live? Academic institutions, MAPS sponsored sites, already trained clinicians doing their own thing. What thoughts on the bottleneck of training?
Well, it hasn't happened yet. It's to be determined. It's what people listening here and anybody who's interested, it's the problem that we all face, and everybody's using their own creative ideas to do it in the way they think will help. But no one's answered that yet. I think Compass is going to have its own clinics because they have all these, millions and millions of dollars to invest in clinics. So they're going to have their own sort of franchise clinics, I understand. So I think they've probably got that covered. And even for the drug, there's no way that all the Compass psilocybin and all the Usona psilocybin can even touch the demand out there. So early on there was a competition feeling between the two, but not so much now. It's just, they're just different things. And the other part is money. And there's a large movement in some movement in psychedelics, and it maps to train therapists of color, minority groups. We're going to treat poor people to make the access more available. There's even an idea to offer it for free through rural hospitals who have patients on a capitation insurance plan. They're just paid to take care of this patient, everything. And because being less depressed or less addicted lowers your healthcare costs and hospitalization. So that's another idea, to get it to people in rural areas, who are suffering, who have no access to this sort of, city approach on the coasts, who need it as much as anybody. So there are a lot of ideas, but they're led to be invented. So this group should be creative.
Yeah, and just another time check. We have 45 troopers still with us. That's
all right.
awesome.
All right, good.
But but we have, let's aim for just like 10 more minutes, just for the sake of attention span.
Sure, okay.
And dinner times and bedtimes. Any other thoughts you had? Someone had asked about, what are your thoughts on the best to increase, access? Oh. Hello?
You broke off. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I think I'm frozen. Can you still hear me though?
I can now, yeah.
Any ideas on how to increase the diversity of the participants in the trials?
Increase the what of participants?
The diversity, I think, in whether that.
Oh, I don't have an answer for that. I know Hopkins, I know NYU, the places, there are a lot of Black African-American people in those, NYU, New York and Baltimore. They just have not had success in trying to reach those populations Um, having therapists and researchers who are in those demographics, I'm sure would help. My guess is some of it's cultural. It's like, you know, in New Mexico, there's almost no African Americans at all. There's a lot of Hispanics, and interest in psychedelics in Hispanics is low. You don't see Hispanics at recreational music festivals where people take psychedelics. You don't see them at conferences. You don't see African Americans at conferences. Conferences cost money. It could be a socioeconomic thing. It just requires some hard work and money to make it available to people in those populations.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I think
Yeah. I see two pictures, but I can hear one of them.
okay, yeah, I deleted, I don't know what happened. I deleted myself there for a second.
Okay.
But back on, and so I'm sorry, I missed the end of that.
Just said more money is needed for people who can't afford it, basically, which are a lot of minority people. And it's hard work needs to be done to find those people and give them the opportunity.
I think Zoom is like, has a bedtime here. It's malfunctioning closer to the
Okay.
end here. So maybe anyway, just a couple more.
Sure.
One that I remember before it crashed on me the first time. So we'll just go two more. One
Sure.
that I remember, I think Becca asked, what does a typical day look like for you with your work at Hefter and everything else you're doing?
Well, Hefter has two extremely part-time staff. I'm one of them. We work probably a quarter FTE between the two of us. I spend about a few hours a week, 6 or 7, sometimes 8 hours a week on Hefter stuff, but it's in my head all the time. So all we do, we take proposals, we have them reviewed. I should say that we have them reviewed anonymously by 3 experts, the best we can find, and we get the proposal as good as it can be. And then we find the money to pay for it and send it to the university. MAPS has about, I don't know, look at their website, 40, 50 people, but they're doing much, much more. They're doing their own drug development, you know, they're doing their own research, they're doing their own advocacy. So Hefter has no building, we're virtual. So it's
well suited for the Zoom era.
yes.
Okay, one more actually, and then I'll wrap up question.
Okay.
What do you think about the use of psychedelic therapy for personality disorders?
Good luck is my first thing I have to say. I have one person I mentored who said he will not give ketamine. He's a doctor. He will not give ketamine to someone with a borderline personality. Another person says ketamine is the best thing for borderline personality. Some studies screen out people with, I forget which type, number is 1, 2, and 3, which group of cluster B or something. They won't do that with psychedelics, but just because they could potentially decompensate or it could be difficult. But I think that people, let's take borderline, could certainly be helped, and that therapy is already hard. Maybe it would get a little harder, but it's hard to imagine. I think things like sociopathy, narcissism would be more difficult. I just don't see psychedelics. I just don't see psychedelics affecting those personalities as much. I mean, people can think narcissistically on psychedelics and antisocially. It sort of frees them up to not feel even less guilt than they do, you know, an antisocial person. But borderline, neurotic anxiety, depression, I think it definitely could help those people. But personality disorders are already notoriously difficult and take a long time.
Yeah, so just another instance of psychedelics, not miracles, not panacea.
Yeah, not miracle, not panacea, right?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm so grateful you stuck around with us, and for everybody who's still here, it's again, it feels like a conversation. I get that feeling. Obviously, I'm the one talking, so I feel like really here with you, and it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
The last thing I would say, any closing thoughts, any advice or thoughts for the people in the audience?
Well, I just feel very positive in the long run. I mean, I'm delighted. I mean, you have a Stanford interest group now. That's great. Stanford's an amazing top university, and you have people that are interested in psychedelic research, and that's fabulous. And I hope it spreads more. I think it will spread more. And just don't proselytize. Don't be Timothy Leary. I think for therapists, having a spiritual practice, a meditation practice, or yoga is something is helpful because people can get carried away. People can abuse psychedelics, and I think therapists are at risk of that as well as anybody. And we need to help each other. And then there's being messianic, which can happen with a lot of Mdma or something, and you just have to watch that because it gets into religion. And connect with regular people, and don't make it your whole thing. Have a regular practice. I worked the last 10 years at the State Mental Hospital. Found it very grounding, and those people need a psychiatrist, and a good balance actually to the psychedelic stuff. So those are my closing thoughts, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Johnny.
Really appreciate you being here. Thanks for answering all those questions. And some part of this hopefully will all of this was recorded. Some of it hopefully will be made available. We'll talk about that, and I'll share with everyone afterward. But thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.